any black who has ever said anything good about a white liberal? Sure, they'll fleece them for money, but blacks love the treason and hate the white traitor. Good for them. The only systematic racism in America is against white people. In today's America, between 1 in 5 and 1 in 4 blacks, a significant overrepresentation works for the public sector, a place that provides reliable middle-class jobs with health care, paid vacations, and other benefits. Public sector workers are unionized at a rate of 35% compared to private sector unions, which are 6%. The typical public sector worker gets 22% higher wages than their private sector equivalents. On the other hand, white people are 77% of minimum wage employees, another massive overrepresentation. These are the shitty jobs with no health care, no labor rights, and always dead ends. White overrepresentation among the working people is by design. A study released last year in the Journal of Experimental Psychology by Aaron Cooley found that when people are given white privilege training, they're far less likely to empathize with the white working poor, while their sympathies increase for blacks. Is it any wonder why fake socialists who promote white privilege bullshit like Vaush love to make fun of rednecks and hicks for their low status? Is it any wonder why all the bankers and capitalists are promoting white privilege bullshit? This is an ideology for oppressing white workers. It's no surprise that once again, capitalist Goldman Sachs simp Destiny and communist Vaush are fighting on the same side against the white working people and the West. James and I will proudly take a stand for our folk and for the pride of European civilization. As for the police, I got no love for the blue. I remember Daniel Shaver being executed as he pled for his life. No fucking congressional hearings there. I remember that murdering pig is walking the streets drawing a taxpayer-funded pension. I remember Jeremy Martis, a 6-year-old boy shot to death by 2 fucking black pigs. One of them is now free. It later came out that one of the black men that shot this little boy targeted his father for assassination because he wanted to fuck his wife. So give me a goddamn break about this systematic racist bullshit. The entire system is anti-white. That's my piece.
Okay. Destiny, do you mind if I go first?
Yeah, knock yourself out.
Yeah. All right, well, that was a fantastic piece of performance art. I would like to remind the two people I am debating that the subject we are debating is, in fact, racism in the criminal justice system. The statement we were asked to provide was this: all else equal, African American people are treated worse by the criminal justice system for no discernible reasons not directly, or at least indirectly, influenced by racism or race-based policies. And I had wondered, coming into this with the totality of evidence on our side, what approach you would take towards rebutting those arguments. And it is clear to me now that theater, as I had anticipated, is indeed the approach you will be taking, because you did not say shit about the actual subject of discussion. Instead, it was the same vague, performative, conspiratorial nonsense you could read off any poll post. So let me actually bring some data into this conversation. The evidence in favor of the idea that black people are discriminated against in the criminal justice system is overwhelming. It is uniformly reified not only by private academics, but also by government institutions, from the FBI to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, that in every level of our criminal justice system, black people are treated disproportionately poorly. And to that, the common response is this: well, black people may get shafted in this way and that way. However, they do more crime. So, in all actuality, they're being treated fairly. No. These studies account for every conceivable socioeconomic confound that is typically used as a means of obfuscating the truth of the matter. We have evidence that black people are, with all other factors apart from race meaningfully accounted for, infinitely more likely to be stopped by stop and frisk procedures, more likely to be stopped by police while driving, more likely to be hit with harsher sentences, particularly with regards to mandatory minimums, more likely to be sentenced to the death penalty. I could read out all of the studies I'm looking at right now, but I imagine we'll have time to go through them one by one. That is the subject I am interested in discussing, not some vague conspiratorial bullshit over whether or not people taking down statues of Confederates means this country is anti-white. And to you, Destiny.
Yeah, wow, I didn't know we were doing theater intros to this, but I would like to point out that I think it's very funny that on one end we have Allsup, who is saying diversity is not working for the country that is literally the head of the world right now, both economically and militarily. And then another guy who has deluded himself into thinking he's European, I guess. But yeah, I mean, narrowing the focus of this conversation onto the criminal justice system and focusing how blacks are disproportionately impacted by said criminal justice system is the reason why me and Vaush are here today. I hope that we don't spend the majority of this debate pandering to these random, stupid talking points about how blacks are different in some other area that's completely, totally unrelated to this discussion.
You got it. And with that, we will go into the open discussion. So thank you, gentlemen, for being here. And I'll be, just to let you know up front, I'll probably be more active just because I expect this might be a little bit wild, but the floor is all yours.
I'm feeling
Sure.
calm.
Well, I'd like to begin by addressing this idea that there is a multitude of studies showing that blacks are, as Vaush put it, infinitely more likely to be stopped and frisked, which, of course, begs the question, well, why would that be? Is this just the predilections of racist police officers that are stopping and frisking blacks for no reason other than evil white racism? Or is there a factual basis for why some groups may be more likely to commit crimes, thus more appropriate targets for a stop and frisk policy, for example?
Let me add something to that, too. Under Mayor Bloomberg, whites were twice as likely to be stopped and frisked as proportional to the violent crime they commit. Blacks are wildly overrepresented in all crimes in New York City, and yet whites were twice as likely under Bloomberg. Bloomberg laughed about this on the radio, by the way. And that was specifically done to create an equalist outcome.
Right. And so it's one thing to say, to compare the percentage of the population to the percentage of those that are stopped and frisked, but you can look at actually those that are arrested and convicted of murder and the rate of stop and frisk for people such as that, or for blacks in that case, the rate of blacks arrested for murder versus the rate at which they are stopped and frisked. And it is disproportionately against whites. Whites are disproportionately stopped relative to the percent of violent crimes they commit. I'd like to begin, if we're going to talk about studies, we can talk about a study from Washington State University.
We don't have too many points.
Yeah,
Can we do these one at a time? I'd like to,
let's.
because I know that the goal is to like put out as much stupid shit as possible. The first thing that you brought up, the idea that like, so a common tactic is to say like weasel words, like, well, blacks commit way more crime than whites, and then you know, whites don't commit as much crime as like, instead of actually like looking at the actual figures. So, for instance, if we were to say that like there is a good reason for black people to be pulled over more than white people, then you would expect to see that those pullovers are actually like accomplishing the goal of like finding more crime. This just doesn't seem to be the case though. So, for instance, an analysis of 4.5 million traffic stops in North Carolina shows that black and Latino drivers are more likely to be searched than whites, okay, given the population. However, despite that, there are still more profitable searches turning up white motorists having contraband. And then this study has been repeated in Nashville as well, where even if you look at the amount of stops, even if you look at the fact that, well, they commit more crime, whatever the fuck that means, when you actually analyze, like, well, how likely are they to turn up contraband or to catch somebody for a crime, they actually aren't being able to justify these stops with these numbers. It's one of the reasons why stop and frisk has been phased out so largely in New York. It's just not good policing. Even if we throw all the social justice, whatever aside, and all the feel good or whatever, if we just look at the raw data, stop and frisk is just not a good way to catch crime. And then this idea that you can say, well, maybe there's a reason. Maybe it's because they think they're more likely to commit blah, blah, blah. What you're doing is you're justifying racism. You're basically saying, well, maybe
I got the
it's more black.
2019 studies here for the crime rate.
Okay, we're not talking about the
This has nothing to do with what we're talking about.
93% of all murders in New York City were committed by blacks.
This is. You're getting excited, Striker. That has nothing to do with what we're talking about.
86% of rapes were committed by blacks and people call
forgive me for doing this. I hate doing this so early. I've got you all on mute. Forgive me for doing this so early. But we come back to you, I promise, Striker, but just because there were a lot of points that I know Destiny wants to get a chance to address as many as possible, promise we'll come back to you, but want to kick it back to Destiny.
Yeah, okay. He'll use his European data to catch back up, I'm sure, or his European DNA. So the thing that I'm trying to focus on is that the idea that even if black people do commit more crime, that doesn't justify the increased number of stops. We can hide behind this idea that black people commit more crime all day. Neither me nor Vaush are going to dispute that. That's obviously true, but that's not a slam dunk. The point is whether or not the total amount of like extra stops that black people receive compared to white people can be justified based on the extra amount of crime they do, and that's just not borne out anywhere. Again, we can always talk about the high crime that blacks commit or whatever, but it just doesn't explain the massive disproportionate amount of stops that black people receive compared to white people, and they don't have the numbers to justify it.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. It's very often the prerogative of these types to just, no matter what evidence you present to them, they lean back in their chair, put their finger to their chin, and say, well, 1350. We understand that there is a disproportionate rate of criminality between the races here in this country. What we are arguing is that the judicial response, the criminal justice system's response to this imbalance, is disproportionate to the extent of constituting racial bias. If the bias is not explained by the crime statistics, then those biases are unjustified, and therefore, by definition, racial biases of the system, hence systemic racial bias.
We can
All right,
kick it. I know that I think Eric, you had a point you wanted to get to.
Yeah, well, if 96% of shootings in New York City are committed by blacks and Puerto Ricans and Dominicans, it actually makes absolute sense to check more of those people for guns. I mean, it's just common sense. Furthermore, you don't interact at all with the fact that whites, who again are marginal in the terms of representation in crime in New York City, are twice as likely, because in comparison to their crime rate, 2 times as likely, Bloomberg said this, he admitted this when he was mayor, to be stopped and frisked, just so that they can even out the numbers. So if there's any institutional racism there, it's against whites.
Yeah, and you could even argue that the problem with stop and frisk was that it wasn't stopping enough black people and enough Hispanics and Dominicans, et cetera. Because if you're looking to catch people with illegal guns in New York City and you have 96% of shootings being committed by blacks and Dominicans and others, then it bears to reason then that an appropriate response from the criminal justice system would be to 96% of people selected for random stops would be those that are doing the shooting. But moreover, we can understand why blacks might feel uncomfortable with that. Why, these are uncomfortable realities for African Americans to experience, that they are more likely to perhaps have police encounters because they're committing more crime. They're more likely to be sentenced more harshly because they're more likely to have prior convictions, right? So all of these things lead to them feeling uncomfortable. That said, this is a system, a criminal justice system that was created by people of European descent, by white Americans, to police white Americans.
I just found their North Carolina study, just real quick. I found their North Carolina study, and it did say that the contraband difference was 32% on whites, 29% for blacks. What that study didn't include, of course, typical dishonesty, is that the blacks had warrants and the searches there are mandatory.
Right,
So
and that's the other thing is when you talk about these studies, if you know about how these work, what will happen is
a lot of points. So just to let
can I
give
just
you a heads up.
address the stops? Just one piece of fact about that, and it's not a new point. But when a police officer engages in a stop, they will run the license plate, and what happens then is dispatch will tell them who the driver is, who the registered owner is, and whether or not they have warrants. In many cases, this then necessitates an arrest if there's an outstanding warrant. And we know that what is the number? Like one in 5 black men will spend time in prison in this country. Blacks tend to have more warrants than whites do. So thus, you would expect to see a higher rate of stop and a higher rate of search. Maybe not as much contraband, but even then, 3% difference, we're within the margin of error.
Because they
Let's
skip
kick it
court.
back over. Let's kick it back over just because there's a lot of points. Just for
a
everybody
lot,
to keep.
and very few of them are relevant. So first of all, I took a look at the 2019 New York City shootings by race statistics that you just cited, and it seems like from what I'm looking at, the arrest rates correspond proportionally, almost exactly, to the rate of victim and suspect, meaning that at least in the case of shootings in this city during this year, there seems to be a relatively proportional rate of arrests to crimes committed. I don't know how exactly this is evidence of some sort of anti-white bias. In fact, I don't know how this is relevant at all to what we were talking about. But yeah, additionally, with regards to the pullover study that you just looked at, you accused us of dishonesty for not mentioning the fact that warrants were a part. Of course, warrants are a part of decision making with regards to searching vehicles that are pulled over. But the fact that there are more warrants proportionally on black people is in support of our argument, because less black people proportionally had contraband in their cars, meaning that even with the distortion that you allege, by the way, I don't know if you're aware of the extent to which that actually influenced the available data, there was still a disproportionate rate of searches to contraband found. Destiny, was there anything in particular you wanted to jump to?
Yeah, I guess one of the really disappointing things about these conversations, and I already see where it's going to go, is that typically if you don't have an actual like data set to back up your argument, we start like reaching to random data. So for instance, for the specific question of, and it's funny because you're even centering on New York City, like this is your slam dunk argument. So what I would expect to see from you guys if stop and frisk was effective is some sort of data showing that, oh, well, once police implemented stop and frisk, either number of violent homicides by firearm decreased, or once they implemented stop and frisk, they were able to procure far more firearms than were before. There's a reason why you guys don't have that data. It's because you know this is a bullshit argument. You know, you can vaguely mention the crime rates of black people in New York City, but that's not really supporting any argument whatsoever. If you want to defend stop and frisk, I mean, I would love to see some data that points to stop and frisk being a good program. You know, initially I was more sympathetic towards it because yeah, black people commit more crime. Maybe it makes more sense to pull them over in some areas. But one of the big reasons why stop and frisk just kind of fell out of favor is because it just didn't work that well. It just didn't really turn up that many more firearms in New York City.
Well, one very important point I need to make about the warrants and people being pulled over is when someone is pulled over and they have a warrant, this will necessitate an arrest. In almost every case, this will necessitate an arrest, which then necessitates a search. So let's say we have two examples, right? We have a black person being pulled over who has a warrant and a white person being pulled over whose car smells of marijuana. Now, the white person who's being pulled over whose car smells of marijuana, this will be a reason for a search. A police officer will search their vehicle, and then contraband will turn up. Now, every black person with a warrant is not driving around with contraband. So the idea that they're being arrested for the contraband, this is a misrepresentation of the data. Now, again, it actually is shocking that 29% of searches of black drivers turned up contraband, because many of these were not predicated. The probable cause for the search was not identifiable smell of drugs or visible drug paraphernalia. These are all probable causes. These were warrants.
Do you have any data? Wait, do you have any data on how many of those searches were initiated by warrants?
Do you?
No, I don't. But I'm not making the claim.
No, but we do have the data available that there are more outstanding warrants, or there's a disproportionate amount of outstanding warrants for African Americans than for whites.
I'm sorry, regarding this data set, did you just imagine a correlative factor that you imagine disproves the data, or do you actually have any evidence?
Are you really going to say that in North Carolina there's not a disproportionate amount of blacks?
Let me check Destiny over here, because Destiny just straight up lied. Lied about stop and frisk. Like, this is what he does.
What did I straight up lie about?
He confidently lies. So we got the data here from New York City. The homicide rate before stop and frisk. Homicide rate was 31 per 100,000 in 1991. After Giuliani implemented broken windows policing and stop and frisk. I mean, this is something that everyone knows, that New York used to be more dangerous.
I love the fact that you're citing the highest crime rate in U.S. history in 91.
Mute him, James. Mute him.
We'll come right back to you, Destiny.
Mute him, because he always does this when he's losing.
Hey,
so
don't be so mad. Okay?
I promise we'll come right back to you, Destiny and Vaush.
Here's the 1991, 31 homicides per 100,000. 2013, that was Bloomberg's last year's mayor with stop and frisk, 3.3 per 100,000 homicides. Okay, that's a massive drop. Okay, from fucking 31 homicides per 100,000 to 3.3 per 100,000. That's post and that's before and after stop and frisk. So you just lie.
Do you have evidence that's because of broken windows policing policy, or does that correlate to a general downward trend of violent crime across the country?
Well, yeah, even across the world. Like, the 90s were the most violent point in all of U.S. history. Like, I could literally point to any spurious correlation that I want and say, well, the reason actually was because I was born in 88 and I was like the savior of the U.S. and everybody looked to me and stopped committing violent crime. You know, you can see 3 years after my birth that happened. You notice
how the older I get, the less violent crime there is in America? I don't know. I think I'm starting to have an influence.
Correlation that we should be concerned about?
Yeah, we can be silly, or we can look at the nationwide rate decreasing crime. And I think the nationwide decrease in crime, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this was around 30% or a 30 to 40% drop in violent crime nationwide, which is superseded by that 90% drop that Striker just pointed out. So yeah, we do have evidence here.
So you're looking at an outlier. 1991 New York City was literally, like, have you seen Escape from New York, like Snake Plissken?
That's what Destiny questioned me on. That's what Destiny.
Yeah, but he was talking about evidence for broken windows policing in general. Did the homicide rate in New
York City drop? The answer is yes.
Nobody contested that it dropped.
Stop and frisk. Wait, have you done research for any conversation ever?
Nationwide falls in crime is, frankly, the criminal justice bill that's always talked about. You know, Trump is always attacking Biden for supporting the criminal justice bill, where Hillary Clinton and the Democrats called blacks predators and so on. They basically just put all these black people in prison. That's why the crime rate went down.
We're pivoting a little bit
You
here.
want to let them out, okay? That's another reason why the crime rate nationwide went down. Okay, they just put all the black people in prison.
Slight pivot.
Okay? Yeah, there you go. Anyway.
Yeah,
go
so as we were saying, New York City in 1991 was about as much of an outlier as you can possibly get when it comes to the murder rate in this country. So to take that one specific country and then all of the dozens and dozens of policies that it's implemented over the past few decades to mitigate that crime rate and go like, oh, well, broken windows policing, in spite of the fact that there was a gigantic nationwide drop in violent crime, and broken windows policing has been implemented in other countries, and in other cities, and has not been found to have those same positive effects, really doesn't speak to the strength of your argument right there. I would argue that New York City was in a uniquely bad place, and it fixed itself in a number of ways. Some of those ways were more effective than others.
And none of those ways, just because you're saying so, involved stop and frisk or broken windows policing. All right.
None of it,
But
none
again,
of
we
it,
can
none of
look
it
to
had
the
anything to
nationwide drop
do. The fall in crime in New York City had nothing to do with the police or a change in police tactics. That's what
Yeah.
they're saying.
And
No,
we can
wait,
look at
wait,
the
I'm sorry.
nationwide
You should
violent crime.
demonstrate that. Demonstrate that.
Can
We
somebody
need
here
to
find
read
that clip?
like-
We can. If I can finish this, we can demonstrate and look to the nationwide decrease in violent crime compared to New York's decrease in violent crime. What was happening nationwide? There was no nationwide stop and frisk. What was New York doing? They were taking violent crime very seriously. They were profiling accurately, relatively accurately, those that were likely to commit the violent crime. And so the crime rate went down. The homicide rate went down. I don't know. And you're saying that New York fixed itself. I mean, come on. You want to demand evidence for, do we have
Magically
evidence for stop and frisk having any effect? Well, this is one of the most preeminent policies pursued in New York, and it led to a decrease in violent crime that beat the national average. So that seems to be compelling evidence right there.
Right. Well,
If
here's
it was, then
oh,
you should have a
sorry.
study for it.
Oh,
like
what?
that's so easy. Like if you're gonna say that, like, oh, well, stop and frisk definitely led to a decrease
I
in
will
violent crime.
post
Why are
this. I
you
will post
comparing?
the comp stats
no.
for you in the
These
chat.
aren't-
I mean,
it's-
Hold on.
so
Let's hear
we're-
from Destiny.
Yeah, so we're past freshman level of high school in terms of arguing. You can just throw a stat out, right? Like generally, when people do studies, they will do a comprehensive analysis of all the tactics implemented by a certain department. They might go county by county. They might have control cities that they'll compare New York City to look at a variety of different policies to see how they impacted the crime. Not just like, well, here's one stat and it went down, dummy. I'm right. Like, come on, like. This
Yeah, like,
should be simple.
this is
the easiest part of the conversation.
Literally correlation, causation, conflation right here. But I found a study. I'll help you out a little bit. So here's a study on factors which can be attributed to the decrease in crime over the 1990s. And there's a segment for factors which do not seem to decrease to the criminal rate in this country, entitled Better Policing Strategies. It ends with, thus, while the impact of policing strategies on crime is an issue in which reasonable people might disagree on given the lack of hard evidence, my reading of the limited data that are available leads me to the conclusion that the impact of policing strategies on New York City are exaggerated and that the impact on national crime is likely to be minor. So this is a meta-analysis of existing studies that are done on the decrease in crime over the 1990s. I can link it in chat if you like.
Yeah, I really enjoy this this bit of like freshman level going on JSTOR and like finding
Better than having no data. Also,
Hold on.
We
Well, I
do
gave you
have
the
the
comp
data. No,
stats.
One sec.
The crime rate
I
went
mean,
down.
the idea that
it's just ridiculous.
the crime went down. We have a multitude of statistics which we've presented, and then to say, oh well, no, because that's not on JSTOR. So well,
also,
actually,
you have stats, not analysis.
Well,
There's a
hold on a
difference.
second.
Stats out of context mean nothing.
Let me get in on
Come
here.
right back to you.
Listen, the murder rates in places like Baltimore and St. Louis and places that don't have New York City style stop and frisk, the murder rates there are atrocious. Chicago, the south side of Chicago, places like that. So there's a massive gulf. Are you going to literally deny
Do you have any data
that
on
New
this?
York City? New York City is the most safe, one of the most safe big cities in America, if not the safest. This is common knowledge. It's Sunday after Saturday style common knowledge. And if we have to sit here and debate that, then it's just ridiculous. The homicide rate went down drastically after stop and frisk. But let's pretend for a second. Because what I was really, the reason I wanted to talk to black people instead of two disingenuous white liberals.
Can we get to the
is that
relevant
we
points?
Yeah, can we
James,
actually
really,
hurry
Can
up?
we not do this?
we,
I don't
we,
want
we can no, I'm gonna fucking do it.
He's gonna do it.
The reason why is that I want to talk
It's
solutions.
calming for him.
Because I'm willing to accept that black people may perceive that a white cop or a white judge or a white jury may discriminate against them. And you know what? There might be cases like that. I'm not saying there's not. The point is, what I'm saying is, what is the solution to that? Now,
Are you conceding the
solution-
argument?
excuse me?
That's cool.
no.
So you agree that there is criminal
What he's saying
justify
is
us
there
against.
may be a perception.
No,
What I
no,
said in the
I'm-
opening is
I'm-
that there may
I'm
be a
speaking-
perception among blacks. There may be a perception
Yes.
among blacks. They're being treated unfairly
Right.
because they look at a white judge and they look at a white prosecutor and say, well, 1 + 1 = 2. That I'm going to jail not because I smothered that toddler like Reese Bowman was this 8-month-old who was smothered by a
You
black
make
caretaker.
fun of that
Oh,
line of
let
thought.
me-
Wait, you
let
make
me-
fun of
let me
that line of
finish.
thought, but that's
No one's
unironically
making
what you're
fun.
doing.
Well, let's
Let
get
me-
back to the main point.
Yeah,
and then
can I
we'll go back.
just finish the sentence?
Yeah, about black people.
Right, is that they may have a perception they're being treated unfairly, but that's not the case. So the problem that presents itself to us is how do we address this nationwide problem where 15% of the population or so feels like they can never get a fair shake in the system? Can we even build a system where everyone is governed by the same laws and criminal justice system? What Striker and I will argue is that that diversity and integration is not working because you will always have these perceptions of unfairness, as wrong as they may be, statistically wrong as they may be. So what do we do with that?
Well,
Okay,
the
so
first
that-
thing we have to do is real quick. I'm sorry, just real quick.
for
You go. The first thing we have to do is we have to figure out that the first step to solving any problem that you learn at any stage in your life is to identify the problem. So if they have a perception that they're being untreated or that they're being treated unfairly, but they're not actually being treated unfairly, well, then the solution is going to be a hell of a lot different than if they are actually being treated unfairly. So I don't know why we're trying to skip over that part of determining descriptively whether they are or are not being treated unfairly. I think that's really important before we move on to some weird conversation about black people not being able to live alongside white people or something. I think it's good to identify whether or not they are being treated unfairly first. So just curious. So if we're just going to do the stats game or whatever, because we don't actually know the difference between citing 1 or 2 numbers versus an actual study done by educated people in the field, I've linked something in the Zoom group chat. So you can see that the biggest fall or decline in murder rate, right, after 2009 is actually coinciding with a huge fall in stop and frisk. And that the massive rise in stop and frisk from the early 2000s didn't really seem like it was correlated with the decrease in violent crime. Can you explain here, if stop and frisk is supposed to be lowering violent crime, why these numbers would be like anti-corollary like this?
Yes.
Oh, I'd like to add to that really quickly, if I may. And it would be very much appreciated if you would actually stick to the point and not go to this weird ancillary conspiracy bullshit about white civilization. I don't know why you're making fun of your perceived belief of how black people perceive the criminal justice system. You're making fun of them for what you consider to be an intuitive judgment when all you've been giving us is intuitive judgment. Well, look at Baltimore.
Thank you for clarifying the black point of view.
Look at these cities. There's crime there. There's black people. What more do you need to know? It's common sense. It's not surprising to me that you balk when provided actual studies from actual people who actually have the education to analyze data and come to conclusions.
The drop in crime rate in New York City. I can explain that. Can I explain it?
Explain the data that was just provided to you by Destiny.
I'm going to explain the data real quick. Black people are leaving New York City because they're getting priced out. The black population in the last decade has dropped by 23%. Does that make sense to you? They're just leaving. They're moving to other states.
So I like how we've moved completely from stop and frisk to, well, now it's because they're leaving. This is why studies are important, guys, instead of just looking at like 1 or 2 numbers. Because now if we say, well, actually, it didn't drop as the same percentage, you're going to throw up another one. Well, actually, that was when BETV stopped showing like as much violent program. Well, actually, that was because of blah, blah, blah.
Have you been to Harlem lately?
This is why we need...
It's full of white people now.
Why did you just lie, Striker? In 1990, the
sec.
black population in New York City was 98.7%. In 2010, it's 25.5%. That's a 3 percentage point drop. You're saying that's going to account for the massive...
I will link you a demographic study from a black website.
I don't care where it comes from.
Oh, you don't care about it? Okay.
No, I just care about how accurate the data is.
Are you suggesting blacks don't have the authority to speak on these topics?
I think the person who has the best idea should have the authority. Hey, listen. As a white guy,
I'm sorry.
Wait, hold on.
Main topic.
As a white guy who appreciates the importance of empiricism, I would not want either of you motherfuckers speaking for me in any regard. So no, I do not think that race is actually the determining characteristic for whether or not data is correct.
We don't speak for you.
Yeah, and also let's be real. If you claim to speak on behalf of Europeans, I mean, we might as well be speaking on behalf of people.
Yeah,
Come on, Striker, let's be
absolutely.
real, dude.
Okay.
My brother
will-
Destiny over here.
We'll kick it over to
Europeans
James and Eric
and
now.
whites in the New World
We'll
have nothing
give
in
a
common.
minute or two to
Okay.
just to be sure. Hold on, just to be sure there's order. We'll kick it over to Eric and James to give responses now.
Yeah, Striker, if you want to finish what you're saying.
2000, what I was saying is that the black population in New York City from 2010 to now went from 28% in 2010 to 22%, and it keeps on dropping. Okay.
Wait, from what year to what year? I actually missed that. I'm not.
It's in the chat. You can look at it.
Okay, I'll look at it.
So black people are just leaving the city because they're getting priced out. You know who's pricing them out? It's people like you and Destiny who are gentrifying all these neighborhoods that they
What
live
does this
in.
have to do with
Harlem
our
is full of
arguments?
whites now. Harlem is full of white people.
No,
now
he's right
because
there. I've got
liberals-
4 homes in Harlem right now that I exclusively lease out to
Well,
white
I
families.
think it is.
People that
Are
think
you
like
denying
you.
that it's important if we're going to talk about the amount of black crime in a city? the amount of black people isn't relevant? Is that the suggestion here? Because I think it's actually very relevant.
What would be
Okay,
relevant is you addressing the data.
The problem is that you guys
he's
haven't
getting
found an
mad.
actual analysis. You're just throwing out random numbers. First of all,
he's
I like how you
Destiny-
started citing crime from 91, ignoring the fact that Stop and Frisk didn't start until fucking 2002. Okay, so firstly, that's funny. Okay, that you go back to the most violent point in history, and then you try to draw a line between then and now, in times when Stop and Frisk wasn't even implemented. And then instead of actually having an actual analysis by an actual educated person taking into account a lot of variables, you're just trying to throw 2 or 3 stats here. We've got like monocausal things going on here. It's just so stupid.
Likewise, they're trying to use a population drop in black people in New York City from 2010 to present day, as though that explains a crime change that took place from the 1990s. Yeah. Do you realize you could have done some research beforehand, maybe found a couple of data points?
No, listen. Will you listen? Listen, it's pure snark, very little said. You guys are actively and maliciously misinterpreting what I said. Stop and Frisk, which is a part of broken windows policing, right? It's associated with it. Would you admit that? You will. So, broken windows policing.
I thought you said you wouldn't speak for me.
Under Bratton and Giuliani, from 1990 to 1992, you had from 1994 to 96, Bratton was the New York City Police Department commissioner. So the point is that Bratton, Giuliani, and Kelling were the ones that came up with the theory and implemented it in the early to mid 90s. Okay, and that's just so happens that the crime rate went down drastically. I'm not talking about crimes like pissing in the street and things like that. They did police that, but also crimes like the philosophy behind it is that people that are, and I'm not saying I necessarily agree with all of this, by the way, but the philosophy of broken windows policing is that if you allow fare evasion or people get drunk in public and things like that, those people are more likely to commit more violent crimes. So they lock them up ahead of time. Now, you could say that's wrong, that's right, whatever. It dropped the crime rate, okay? It's just logic. The types of people that do that
What year
are going to
was
be...
this implemented?
This is in the early to mid-90s. Look up Giuliani, Mayor Giuliani. I'm sure you know who that is. And Commissioner Bratton and Kelling. These were the guys that created broken windows policing and stop and frisk that was implemented at the same time.
Which one?
Broken windows policing is not a policy.
It's
That's
a
an
it's like
overall
a
theory on how to
philosophy.
deal with crime. I don't even know if you know.
Right.
What
Again, this is splitting hairs. And,
No,
and
we're-
it's
I'm
not-
asking you.
Wait, that's like saying, what was your favorite policy of
Thank you.
George Bush?
Thank
You
you.
say
Thank
the
you.
war on terrorism or the war.
No,
That's not
it is
a
a-
policy.
well,
That's like an
again,
overall
Okay,
ideology.
it is
for how to
a
approach something.
guiding, yes, it is a guiding theory on policing. That is true, and it is a theory that informed the policies they implemented as mayor.
Don't even
and
bother
police
explaining.
commissioner.
Let's
I mean,
just-
this
let's
is
just
this
keep
is
going
this is
This
the
is
reality.
Striker learned
By the
something
way,
new at least.
well,
They
by
have
the-
no argument, so that's
By the
what they have
way,
to do.
1990 New York City black population 29%, 2010 25.5. So we see an approximate, what is that, 12% drop in the black population in those years.
And from when to when? What was the decrease
90 to
in violent
2010.
crime? 90 to 2010. And what was the decrease? He said 30 homicides to 3. And that little itty bitty 12% drop in the black
Well, combine
population.
that with
was
broken windows policing and
100,000.
stop and frisk.
Oh my
you start-
God! You know what would be a great way to combine that with? It would be done in a study. That would be
Well,
great.
let's
Could
study
you
the term-
imagine
the
that?
term
Could
for
you
this-
imagine an
homicide
actual
rates of
researcher that
cities-
tried to correlate all these things.
The
Let's
term for
study
this
the-
is
let-
superlative correlations, in which when you get a grab bag of data points that sound convincing and
Yeah,
you
like
start
a
piecing
homicide
together, you put them up in your corkboard, you've got your twine and your push pins, and you try to make a story out of it. All
Are
we
black
have to do
people
is link
more or
studies.
less likely to commit murder.
Wait. What does that have to do with anything? Remember earlier when I said
That's
that
very pertinent
all
to
you
the
types
fact that
do
the
is...
crime rate went down when more black people were policed
Remember how
more
I said
aggressively.
earlier that when you guys are confronted with data more complicated than you're capable of understanding, you lean back and say,
here we go. Here we go.
1350. Hey,
Yep.
wait, really quickly.
Right.
Wait. I want to actually get this back on track really quickly, if I may. I hope nobody minds. Because we've been, I guess, arguing over your inability to understand data for a little while now. We got to maybe 3
You
of
guys
40
are splitting
studies.
hairs.
Hold up.
You guys are
Whoa.
splitting
I
hairs.
agree.
One
We
sec.
are. I agree. So how about we get to the other dozens of studies I have that uniformly
This is
inform
why
the
it's a waste
idea?
of time to debate white liberals. They're just cynics.
Oh,
They're
you're
disingenuous.
backing off? That
Well,
easy?
Well, I mean,
No,
this is an important
this is-
point, though. The idea that data only becomes valid when packaged by someone at a university in a certain way that agrees with you.
Classic
It's entirely
anti-intellectualism.
That's
No,
a
it's-
really
it's
good
not
point that James brings up.
anti-intellectualism.
Yeah, but the funny thing is that any educated person listening to this, the fact that you just said is an insult with standard practice, data isn't worth anything as a single stat. Of course, these are always contextualized. The fact
Right,
that
and
you
we're
thought
giving
that
the
was some
context,
kind of
Destiny. We're giving the context for
you're
them.
No, you're giving
creating
random
context.
data
them.
You're
points.
The idea that
creating
they-
context.
statistics are
What we'll do
invalid
is, hold on
unless
one
they
sec.
come from
Just
the
we're going to
ivory
just
tower.
forgive me. I've got everybody on mute. Just want to. What we'll do is change things up a bit with maybe 2 minutes from each side, kind of alternating back and forth, just to be sure that it's been going really well so far. And so it's at the same time bubbly. So where were we last? Who would be willing to
I'd
defer
like to move
the
the
other?
conversation in a more productive direction, if I may.
I would, but I would also like to talk about this just for like 1 minute too, because it's just very important.
We can split 1 minute between us. You want to go first?
Sure, that sounds great. Okay,
You go
let's
first.
do it.
All right.
Yeah, okay. So like you creating context for a given stat isn't just comparing one number to another. That's not creating context. Anybody that's ever read a single econ study, a single sociology study, any study like this will know that when you actually try to measure the effectiveness of a given policy, there's a lot of things that go into that work. So for instance, you might see if other cities that are comparable in population demographics or socioeconomic status had similar or different policies. You might compare the effectiveness of the policy given different types of populations. You might do it over like a time scale. There's a lot of different things that you have to keep in mind when you're comparing policies between states or between like even a city and then prior in that city when you didn't have it. The idea that you think that you can just throw up one stat when I could point to like any number of other stats, for instance, like the number of prison inmates rose, the size of the police force grew, unemployment rate dramatically fell between 1990 and 1999, 25%. Like all of these things can be correlated with like decreases in burglary, homicides,
you're making
all
our
these other
point.
things.
We're at
I'm
about
not making any point.
35.
Anyway, go for it.
35
Yeah,
seconds.
and I'll
yeah,
finish.
okay, so-
I'll finish
go
from
for it,
my
go
side
ahead.
if I may. So yeah, we can run this back a little bit. So a report on jury selection showed that between 1990 and 2010, state prosecutors were about twice as likely to strike black people eligible for juries in criminal cases as opposed to 26% of white people. It was double even after taking account of other correlative factors. The authors of this study testified in court, saying the odds of this taking place with no implicit bias with regards to race were about 1 in 10 trillion. We have studies on implicit bias with regards to mock jurors. We have them in plea bargaining. We have them in charge sentencing. We have them in death penalty sentencing. The amount of data on this, for you to get knocked down in the weeds of like, well, what year was broken windows policing, the policy of
something
broken
you guys
windows policing
pressed.
implemented? No, we didn't bring up New York. That
Yes,
was
you
you
did.
guys.
People can rewind.
Okay,
and
well,
watch.
we'll
They
do
can
it.
rewind. You guys
We'll-
started with New York
we'll do
City.
it.
The
Yeah.
point,
We'll
the
switch
point
it.
is,
We'll
why,
switch it. So
why,
that was
why
about
were
a
those
minute-
black
that was about a
jurors
minute.
struck?
Hold on a
Well, yeah,
second.
I'd like to make a
That
point
was
that-
about a minute.
See,
25.
why?
Hold
Find
on
a
second.
study.
Gentlemen. All right. Well, that was a minute 25 from Destiny Vaush. We'll give the same to Eric and James.
Yeah, Striker, just real quick. The reason why jurors will be struck as part of the voir dire process is prior convictions, right? And so if you have prior
Accounted for.
convictions,
Accounted
if
for.
you have prior convictions, then
Accounted
you
for.
will be struck.
Hold on.
Hold on. Sorry.
No,
who's
not
saying?
you, Vaush.
Just
Oh, okay.
clearing it
Let
up
him
so
go,
he knows
Vaush.
where to go.
I
from
want to
now.
hear this.
Yeah, and also, I mean, this analysis is only focusing on white jurors. I would like to see a similar study, as you apparently have a wealth of them, on black jurors and whether or not black jurors have biases towards whites. And this gets to the bigger point here is that you may be able to find some whites or some blacks that have implicit biases towards each other. This is not borne out in the way the system treats people, for sure. But I mean, the point being, the idea that blacks cannot be biased against whites, I would disagree with that.
No. Wait, I never mentioned the race of the
One
people
sec.
who
They've
struck
still,
the
they've still got
jurors.
about 30. Still got about 30 seconds.
Let the European go.
Yeah.
If you
Well,
want us,
here's the thing. Here's the thing. The concept of a Bronx jury is very well known. It's an implicitly and explicitly biased black jury. Not to mention the fact that jurors, like James said, are often struck because they have criminal records or they have some other issue going on. So, I mean, all these questions always beg the question, why? Why are blacks treated slightly differently than whites? Why are they more likely to get struck from a jury? Why are they more likely to be stopped and arrested? And the question, and then the answer where we disagree, we both agree on the fact that blacks are more likely to commit murder. I mean, I'm sure you guys already agreed to that. So the question is then,
About time.
yeah. So the
If
question
you
is,
want to.
And time.
Are you guys
I'd
on?
love to respond. So again, that was accounted for. I never mentioned the race of the people striking the eligible jurors. And additionally, I love the fact that whenever presented with data you're unfamiliar with, you don't know anything about this study. You don't know any of its control variables, when it was conducted, how it was conducted, the selection size, the sample rate, the p-hat. You don't know anything about it. But you're like, well, something has to account for that bias. It can't be racism. Maybe there were oh, wait, we accounted for priors. Maybe they smelled worse. You would go to anything. And this is the reason why we get to point to studies and you get to point to out-of-context data
we can
points.
cross-reference.
Because it is
we can
very
cross-reference it.
easy.
Are blacks more likely to be felons? The answer is yes.
Let's give
That
another
has
15
wait.
seconds.
I think that's a really important. That has literally nothing to do
With getting
with the
struck from a
study that I
jury,
have cited.
absolutely it
Hold on
does.
one
No,
sec.
that's accounted for.
That's called racism. Or what if you're trying to say that like a jury is more likely to be biased
Yeah.
against a black
Oh.
person because
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Yeah, I misinterpreted that. If you're saying, well, those black jurors were more likely to have been criminals, that's accounted for. If you're saying, well, they were more likely to have been struck because the person doing the striking believes they're criminals, that's literally racism you're defending.
So we agree with each other then. That's
Go
fine.
ahead and take
Yeah,
it.
you're
James.
just pro-racism and we're anti-racism. We're not
Yeah.
arguing over whether it exists,
ahead.
just whether or
Go-
not it's
go
good.
ahead.
That's about a
Yeah,
minute
James.
20. So we'll kick it over to James and Eric for a minute 20.
Yeah, I mean, the idea though that jury selection in and of itself is can it be looked at to explain the disproportionate sentencing?
It's not already. I've got data on that too.
1 sec.
Data. Sorry. No. The idea, no, but the idea that the jury selection in this very specific case. Where was this study conducted, by the way?
Let's find out. Michigan State University College of Law. Let's find the population. You can keep talking while I find the population.
Yeah, sure. So the idea that this is an explainer of racism in the criminal justice system. I mean, this study actually is an outlier when you look at other studies that
What other studies?
that examine. Well, I'm about to mention one, Destiny, if you'd let me finish. That, if, for example, study from Washington State University finds that police officers, by the way, these are the police officers that are killing unarmed black men, supposedly, that police officers actually hesitate longer before shooting black suspects than whites.
What does that have to do
what
with
does that
the
have to do with
How do you
study?
get the death penalty if you?
Well,
Do you know what a
you guys
pivot
wanna talk about
is?
studies?
1 sec. I got to give him 20 more seconds.
Okay.
Yeah,
sure.
No, one last thing. One last thing is that Destiny already admitted that the crime rate went down because there's more cops and more people in prison. Okay, that's basically what we all agree on. The question is, why are they mostly black, the ones in prison?
That had nothing to do with the data.
were arguing
that I
about
said.
Well,
Stop and
that's what
frisk.
Destiny said.
No,
That's what
we were
Destiny
arguing
said.
whether stop and frisk was the
More cops,
why
more
people-
prisoners, plus stop and
on.
frisk. In
I
the
don't
New York
think he ever
context,
said
in the
that.
New York
Alright,
context. Yeah,
let's
Chicago has
give-
7 times the murder rate as New York City. Philadelphia
let's
6
give
times the murder
Destiny
rate.
This
as
has
New York.
not- again,
a chance to respond.
Do we
They don't
notice?
have stop and frisk.
Do we
can only
notice
make
the
correlations
pattern?
there.
We
Go ahead.
notice the pattern every time. No actual way of comparing these data points, just throwing out of context data points. It's actually embarrassing. I'm cringing over here. Do you want to respond to the actual data point that I cited with regards? Again, you can find it. The study writers testified under oath the likelihood of that taking place. Those disproportionate odds being about 1 in 10 trillion, unless racism was involved. They testify that in a court of law. Of course, perjury is a crime. If you'd like to look over that and attest to that specifically, that'd be fantastic. I don't know what policing has to do with jury selection, but
I'm just quoting Destiny. Destiny said the crime rate went down because there's more police and more people in prison. That's what he said. So I'll agree with him 2/3 of the way there.
You're
I think in
pivoting
the New York
again.
City context, the reason it's the safest big city in America, or was until very recently, until you anarchists turned it
what
into
the
a
fuck?
jungle.
Do you want me to go to an
You
easier
anarchist
study?
riders, yeah, anarchist riders. Until very recently, it was the safest city in America
want me to
by per capita.
Go to an
and you
easier
compare
study
it
for
to
you?
Places, you compare it to places like Chicago. You compare it to places like Philadelphia. You compare it to places, other big cities, and they have no stop and frisk, and the crime rate is exponent murder rate.
What you think
'Cause
New York City
you
is
can't
comparable
blame
to all
dead
those other
bodies
cities?
on racism.
New York City is
You
one of
can't
the
blame
like
dead
most
bodies on
unique-
racism.
We'll
New
kick
York
it
City's
over
one
to
of the most-
Destiny. And,
Yeah, I'm just the idea that you think that New York City is comparable to those other cities. New York City is one of the most unique cities in the United States of America, right? That, like picking out like things particular to New York. If we've seen anything, with the whole coronavirus stuff, like we can see that New York City is like a pretty unique place in terms of like
Move
how
that
it sits in the
goalpost.
world. I'm not moving any
Hold on.
goalpost.
Move
You
it.
haven't met the
We've gotta let him
incredibly low
finish.
bar that we've already set.
Hey, Bugman, I lived
gotta
in New
let him
York City. I
finish.
Hey,
lived, I
calm
was born and
calm
grew up
down,
there. What
Strike.
are you
Calm.
telling me?
Whoa
We've
there,
got-
big
we've got
boy.
Another minute. We got
What is-
another minute left.
Why like I don't know what to say. Like when you're throwing out, like I lived there. Like I went out on the streets every day and I collected unbiased
there's-
data
there-
on
honestly-
the crime rates and I looked at the
There's not even
thousands-
anything to respond to be
yeah,
honest.
I don't know what to say. This
You-
is like cheating because if they say a bunch of dumb shit for 2 minutes, James, and I have nothing to respond to, what am I supposed to do with my time?
Yeah, we
Okay,
can.
well,
Well,
then-
I
well, then
can. I can
how-
I wasn't
always.
ready for this
you
strategy.
address-
I can throw out a new study if we want. So in this
Well,
study,
let's address my study first, actually.
What
Vaush.
study?
Let's address the study from Washington State University. I believe it was 2013
Uh-huh.
that found that police officers. You can talk about jury selection.
Oh yeah,
and
no,
again,
that study is right. Yeah, we can give you that one. We can give you that one, and it doesn't impact anything else. You're
I
saying.
have
Police
never
will
made the
look at
claim.
shoot-
I have never
police-
made the claim. This is a white on black thing. Only systemic bias against black people committed
It might-
by
it might
white or
be
black
that-
cops, white or black judges. Doesn't matter.
And it might be
So-
that
wait,
police
so-
hesitate more before shooting a black person than a white person. That has nothing to do with the broader argument, though. Like, that's great that you have that one.
Well, I'm
study.
sure
Seemed
it
to be a
does.
reasonable one. I read it. Yeah.
It would, though, doesn't it? Because what you're contending is that there is a nascent racism that is that pervades the criminal justice system, and if that were to be true, you would expect that to be present in the frontline enforcers of that criminal justice system.
Can I take a second
which
to
is
explain
police.
systemic bias?
Well,
Also,
allow me to finish my point here. And the study from Washington State University found that that police officers are the most likely to hesitate 1.61 seconds before shooting a black suspect compared to 1.37 seconds for a white suspect. And that might seem like a small amount of time, but in a critical life or death situation, that is very important. And so again, this idea that if the police officers, which again are the frontline enforcers of the criminal justice system, you claim to be racist, if they were to be racist against blacks, for example, then they would be less hesitant to shoot them, right? But they actually hesitate longer for blacks than they do with whites.
okay, so again, we never made any counterclaim on that one. It makes sense that given all of the racial antagonism surrounding the police brutality that they commit against black people, that they might be more hesitant in some instances to open fire on black people. We never made any claim counter to that, and it has nothing to do with our broader claim. Do you think it's a little bit funny that I'm like, here's a bunch of like meta-analyses on broader racial injustice, and you say, well, here's one study. It takes the cop 1.2 seconds longer to kill the black man.
That's exactly what you're doing, Vaush. And by the way, would that not be an example of an anti-white bias? If you guys want to present the argument that there's an anti-black
Sure,
bias
now
in
just
policing,
demonstrate it
what
in
we
the
have
entire
here is
criminal
now
justice
evidence-
system.
Is evidence
We're
of an
talking
anti-white
about the
bias.
totality of the criminal justice system right now. We're talking about a disproportionate thing that black people face at every single level of law enforcement, not just whether or not white cops are more likely to pause when they're shooting
Well,
white or
except for
black
police
people.
engagements, apparently. But this is
Well, no,
this is
we
so
are talking
great.
about police engagements. Hold on. Do you think that the only type of police engagement
So
is
what's
people
Black Lives
shooting at
Matter
somebody?
about? If it's not about shooting unarmed black men, what the
We're
fuck
not
is it?
talking about Black Lives.
We're
Why do you
talking
keep
about
pivoting to
systemic
other?
You're not talking-
racial
so
bias.
what the?
Hold on.
Oh,
one second, one
oh my
second.
God!
Let's
Hold
slow
on.
down.
I'm sorry.
Let's slow down.
Striker,
Go
hold on.
ahead, go ahead.
Striker, call me there. I'm sorry.
Go ahead, go ahead.
If you want, either you or maybe if you've got a caretaker can check your email. You can actually go and
There
look at
we
what we're
go.
supposed to be talking about. It's not Black Lives Matter.
Oh.
Maybe you're in the wrong debate. I'm not sure if there was like a Daily
Oh.
Stormer episode that you're missed or something. But yeah, I mean, you
They
can go
want
check
an
the email.
easier
It's
topic.
It's so pedantic. It's so
Yeah,
pedantic.
there we
No,
go, here
it's
we
a,
go.
No, I
wait,
mean,
listen,
we have
buddy,
here
my
It's not
friend,
pedantic. It's the
One second.
point.
my good,
One
my
second.
fellow.
He's not making- they're not
Whoa,
making any argument.
calm down,
Let's
my
see,
fellow.
just hold on one second.
The discourse, my fellow European friends. Okay, we came here to talk about whether or not there is a systemic bias against black people in the American criminal justice system, and the evidence to that effect is very compelling. We acknowledge that study on cop fire delay times does not rebutte our point in any way, shape, or form. And it's entirely possible for a criminal justice system, which is generally biased against black people, to sometimes have disproportionate outcomes against white people. For example, I believe that for the most part, we live in a pretty sexist society against women, but men get shafted in some pretty specific ways that I'm happy to acknowledge. But when I'm trying to talk about society at large, it's a little weird if we're looking at a totality of data and you keep pointing out like family courts. And that's what we're doing right now, essentially. So if we may, I'd like to move on to another study. I'm very interested in hearing how you're able to divinely talk about which correlative factors they weren't able to account for in this one. In this study, two groups of mock jurors were given a collection of race-neutral evidence from an armed robbery, with one group's alleged perpetrator being shown to be light-skinned and the other dark-skinned. These mock jurors were significantly more likely to evaluate ambiguous race-neutral evidence against the dark-skinned suspect as incriminating and more likely to find that dark-skinned subject guilty. Now, there are no other confounding variables here. It's a study. It's an experiment. There's nothing else. It's all mocked. And yet, in spite of that, the jurors, black and white, were more likely to find criminality in the actions of the alleged dark-skinned perpetrator.
So the black people are racist against black people too.
We're
That's
talking
right, yeah.
about systems here.
Well, are systems made up of people, or are they
Yeah.
just
Well,
magical?
I mean, even if we
clouds in
grant
the
that, even
sky?
if we grant that and say, yeah, black people could be racist against white people as well. I mean, the problem right now is that white people have the predominant power in the criminal justice system. So it seems like that's the problem that we should be addressing. right
where are you
That
getting?
would
Where's your
be-
study to show that?
Sure.
You have
And
a study for
Wait,
that?
wait,
Hold
wait.
on.
Are you
Where's
skipping?
my study to show that white people are
Yes.
the predominant power in?
Yes. Where's
I
your
mean, I
study?
could do a composition of Congress.
Show
the
me a
people that
study.
are li-
Are black people are white people more likely to be, I don't know, the mayor of a black majority city?
We
Are
don't
white
need
people
to
more
sink to the
likely-
bad faith
Are
arguments
white
right here.
white people the police chiefs in every place from
Wait,
St. Louis to
this actually
Detroit to
tracks.
Seattle.
You think Western
me, like-
civilization is being destroyed, so you must think
Oh,
black
now you
people are
changed the
actually in charge of
topic.
America. That actually
I
makes
don't-
sense from your perspective.
No, wrong. Let me correct you on that.
You think
I don't
Obama's still the shadow president?
I personally have no personal hatred for black people. I don't. And I don't think they're in charge. I think Jews are in charge.
I know.
That's who I think is
We
in
know.
charge.
Don't
So
worry.
if you want to talk about that, we can have that another discussion about that. But
I
don't
know
want
you'd
you
like to move to that because
sponsors.
it's another opportunity for you to use a bunch of
Oh.
spurious conspiratorial claims without looking at any
so-
evidence.
Meanwhile, here you are talking about this white privilege.
Do you want to
nonsense.
respond to the study that I've never said white privilege once in this entire discussion?
I want Destiny to show me a study showing that white people are disproportionately powerful.
Are
in
you
the criminal
pivoting?
justice system. No.
Are
he's
you really?
actually-
Are
he
you
made
avoiding?
a claim and he has no evidence to back it up.
Answer the question.
Show, what question do you
Answer
want
the
to be
question,
answered?
Striker.
What question?
Striker! Why
Yeah,
were
okay,
those
you don't
mock
have a
jurors
question.
biased?
Why? Well, your claim is that black people are racist
No,
against black people. in
no,
jury.
nope. Our
Yes.
claim is that jurors, whether or not they're black or white, Asian, Hispanic, engaged in bias against dark-skinned individuals. Now, in America, where you are
Quantify
tried by
that
a
bias.
jury
Show
of your
me-
peers,
Show me statistics about that bias.
In, yeah,
Show me
sure.
statistics
Yeah, here you
about
go.
that bias.
So in America, we are tried by a jury of our peers, meaning that our
Right.
juries will be made up of black, white, Asian, Hispanic.
I'm
what
asking
have
you, what is
people.
the origin of that bias? Explain that to me.
Wait. So again, you know there's a bias.
No,
You're
I'm
just
not saying. I'm
okay
not
with
admi-
it.
No, hold on. I'm not admitting that. I'm saying you're saying that all races are biased against
You're
black
justifying a
defendants.
racial bias right now. You're doing it. You're making my
well,
argument
that-
for me.
Calling people. First of all, I don't give a shit if you call me racist, and second of all,
It makes my
I don't
argument
care.
easier, if
Maybe
you are.
racial biases are real. I mean, men. I guarantee that there are studies that show men are more likely to be frowned upon by a jury than women.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
There's plenty of studies.
Yes.
So
and
is
the-
that
yeah,
because
and
of
then
systematic misandry?
bias? Yes, against men in the criminal justice system. Yes, for violent crimes, men are
Oh.
significantly more likely to be sentenced, and I've talked about that on stream and in
So
fact done
that's
videos on it.
anti-male bias. Then.
Yes.
You believe in that.
Or I
Okay.
guess too light on women. I don't really know, but it's one of those things. Yeah.
So what's your solution to that? Is
Wait,
that to
are you? So
increase
you
penalties
really
on
are
women?
pivoting? I actually just responded to your question, and you're unwilling to address the specific thing that I just said.
Are men more
you okay?
likely to be? Are juries more likely to be biased against
Why are you
men
pivoting?
Because men can. Are juries more likely? Because I'm trying.
Why
'cause
are you
the problem
pivoting?
is, if we talk about race, you're set in your ideology, right?
Why?
You have a racial ideology. You don't have a canned line for
Are
the rest of the stuff.
You
So here you go. If a jury is
Pivoting.
more biased against black people, what were the factors like the nature of the crime, the rap sheet of the black criminal, all of these things?
Wait,
that
this is
come
an
into
experiment.
question?
There's
Oh,
no rap sheet.
Actually, I'm going through the thing right now, and he does bring up a good point because all of these crimes were stealing truckloads of Nikes. So Striker actually just completely blew us out of the water on that one. Fuck, I'm sorry.
It's an
we have to move on to the
experiment,
next one.
Striker. There's no other correlating factor you can
Like, I
point
don't think
to.
you understand that these aren't real life people, right? They don't. These aren't.
Does
What
he
I'm
know?
saying-
Who
what
are
I'm
we
saying
talking
is that
to?
What I'm saying
I also,
is just
and,
like
this is
Jesse
another
Jackson.
reason. Hold on, you just
What
took
I'm
like 12 minutes.
saying
Okay.
is just
Another
like
reason why
Jesse
it's
Jackson, just like Jesse Jackson said once that when he hears footsteps behind him and he turns around and sees a black man, he's a lot more scared than if he sees a
What
white
are we?
man.
What are we
Black
talking
people-
about?
I'm sorry, is Jesse
Blacks-
Jackson the secret fifth person here in this?
Juries are
I
more
don't know why
likely.
we're talking about
James?
Juries are more likely to be. Hold on a second, I'm getting a phone call here.
Yes, quickly find some time. Now,
We do have one. Well, I want to make a quick announcement. We have something weird. We're both computers. I can't currently access the super chats. I think I just tweeted YouTube. I don't know if this is like for everybody or just me, but it is on both computers. So it's also on multiple browsers. Don't worry, folks. Working on it, but just want to let you know we. So maybe we'll just go a little bit longer than expected.
we
in
crashed
terms of-
YouTube.
I'm not sure what's going on. I can get them to load in the Creator Studio, but I can't pull them up where it, like has their own little like